Okay, we'll start today's class. In last class, we wanted to discuss those topics, or rather subtopics, from the topic of phenomenology in Western philosophy, which have been repeatedly been asked in previous years. Uh, so we'll take up those straightway. Uh, See, I have selected three topics uh, from that chapter. So we'll take up those three topics uh, now. See, the first topic which I have taken is Husserl's notion of epoche and reduction. Epoche is also called bracketing. Uh, so this is the first topic which I have been taken up. Uh, in fact, one more thing I just want to tell you before I start. See, all the three topics which have been selected will be overlapping with each other in many ways, and the basics which have been covered in earlier class also will be repeated in these topics because the substance of his philosophy remains the same. So actually Husserl developed the philosophy of phenomenology as a method to study how things appear in consciousness. This was his basic attempt and concept. Now, before, he thought of developing this, he analyzed the earlier existing trends in philosophy. And since he's a modern philosopher, because he's a 20th century philosopher, so earlier dominant trends, two dominant trends in earlier modern philosophy, one was naturalism and another was psycholism. Now, naturalism explains everything in terms of natural sciences, and psycholism reduces logical truths and meanings to psychological processes. So these two were the main trends. Now, Husserl believed that both these approaches distort the true nature of knowledge. According to him, philosophy must return to the things themselves. In fact, this is also a quotation from him. On this also the questions are asked many times. So he gave the slogan, return to the things themselves. So that is to the direct experience of phenomena as they appear in consciousness. Now, for achieving this, he developed the phenomenological method. And the two central aspects of this method were bracketing and reduction, that is epoche or bracketing and reduction. And this is what the first topic I am discussing, Husserl's notion of epoche and reduction. So these are the two basic concepts or two basic aspects, central aspects, you can say, of his phenomenological method, which we are going to discuss. And on this, the questions have been asked earlier number of times. So what is phenomenological method? The aim of phenomenology is to grasp the essence of phenomena as they are given in consciousness. Now, earlier we have already discussed this, naturalism and psychologism were the two beliefs which were prevalent. So, how these prevalents were faulty, or the concepts were faulty, now let us first discuss that as a preamble to phenomenological method. Now, naturalistic belief, what we do in everyday life, we assume that the world exists independently and natural science explains everything. Consciousness is often reduced to brain processes in naturalism. Now, this attitude is called natural attitude or naturalism. Now, what is psychologism or psychologistic belief? This tendency explains the knowledge, logic, and meaning merely as a psychological states. Now, this view was associated with thinkers like Hume, and in Indian philosophy, if you take comparative philosophy, uh, with certain forms of Yogacara thought. Now, Husserl argues that both these concepts, naturalism and psychologism, are obscure and do not express true structure of experience. So, therefore, philosophy must suspend these assumptions. So, this was his conclusion. Now, after that, he came up with the concept of epoche or bracketing. This is a Greek term which means suspension of judgment. So Husserl uses it to describe the method of bracketing all presuppositions about the existence and nature of external world. So sometimes the questions are also asked whether Husserl's philosophy denies the word or means bracketing means denying the word. So he came up with the answer: bracketing does not mean denying the word. Husserl does not claim that objects do not exist. What he says, rather, he temporarily sets aside all beliefs about their existence in order to examine how they appear in consciousness. So, according to him, epoche is, or during epoche, scientific theories about objects are bracketed, popular beliefs and prejudices are bracketed, that is suspended. Judgment is suspended. Bracketed means judgments are suspended. Metaphysical assumptions about reality are bracketed. Even the belief that objects actually exist in the world is suspended for the time being. What remains is the phenomena as it appears in consciousness. So, except that, all other judgments are suspended. Now, in this sense, epoche represents a shift from natural attitude, obviously, and also natural attitude to phenomenological attitude, where the focus is not on existence of things, but on their mode of appearance in experience. So this is the central point or main focus of the phenomenological method. Husserl methods here shows that influence of Descartes, because as Descartes used systematic method of doubt, to reach clear and indubitable truths. So Husserl uses bracketing to remove presuppositions that distort experience. But there is a difference also. I mean, minor similarity is there between Descartes and Husserl, but there are differences also. So unlike Descartes, Husserl does not doubt about the word in order to deny it. He only merely suspends the judgment through his concept of bracketing. Now, on bracketing, some critical points also we should try to understand, because his own, subsequent philosophers from the same school, phenomenology, have also criticized this. So later, phenomenologists such as Martin Heidegger and Sartre, they were also existentialists and phenomenologists also. They questioned whether such complete bracketing is possible. Bracketing means, as you know, suspension of the judgment, whether this complete suspension of judgment is possible regarding various things. Heidegger argued that human beings are always being in the world. This is the concept from existentialism. So the word cannot be completely suspended. And according to Sartre, another philosopher, consciousness is always already engaged in the world. So suspension of the uh, judgments are not possible the way in the way Husserl explains. Now, second concept is reduction. First was bracketing or epoche. Second is reduction. Now, epoche only suspends our beliefs about the world. But to understand the essential structure of experience, Husserl proposes the concept of reduction. Now, what is reduction? Reduction here means redirecting attention from external objects to the way the objects are constituted in the consciousness. So this is the second important concept of phenomenological method. Now, through reduction, what he wants to do? He wants to discover that objects are always given in relation to acts of consciousness. Now, this is closely also connected with another aspect of Husserl's theory, his theory of intentionality. Now, intentionality theory was borrowed from another philosopher, French Bentenot, which we subsequently will see what was that theory and how Husserl was impacted or affected by him. Now, according to Bentenot and Husserl, both philosophers, every act of consciousness is directed towards an object. So this is what means. This is what is meant by intentionality. Thinking is about thinking something. Perception is perception of something, and desire is of desire of something. So thus, every consciousness or every kind of is essentially intentional, and this is his theory of intentionality. So even imaginary objects can be intentional objects. He came up to explain that it's not that only real objects are intentional objects, but even imaginary objects can be intentional objects. For example, when we think of a golden mountain, that also becomes, and consciousness here also is intentional. So consciousness is always directed towards an object, even though such an object may not exist in reality. But Husserl distinguishes three forms of reduction. First is phenomenological or psychological reduction. At this stage, all these are gradual forms of reduction, one after the other, basically, if you see. So first stage is psychological reduction or phenomenological reduction. Now, at this stage, we free consciousness from psychological influences such as moods, emotions, biases, and subjective mental states, because these factors often distort our perception. So basically, his ultimate objective was to reach to presuppositionless philosophy or sensations. So first he has to get rid of or reduce it, free consciousness from psychological influences. So this is phenomenological or psychological reduction. These factors, because these factors distort the perception. Now, the aim of this is to study experiences as they are given, without any psychological attachments or explanations. So, phenomenology therefore becomes a descriptive science of experience rather than a psychological theory. So, in this purified state, we return to phenomena as they appear, not as they are interpreted by scientific or psychological theories, which it's basically the theory of naturalism or psychologism prescribed earlier to Husserl. Now, second stage of reduction is transcendental reduction. First was psychological reduction. Now, second is transcendental reduction. So, after removing psychological elements, consciousness may still appear as consciousness of a particular individual. So Husserl therefore performs a deeper reduction, where the empirical ego is bracketed. So after this, what remains is transcendental consciousness. So the universal field in which all meanings and objects are constituted. So therefore, after this stage, what happens? Phenomenology becomes a transcendental investigation of conditions of knowledge. But here again, critics have come up, because by this method or transcendental reduction, Husserl is moving towards transcendental subjectivism. And this is not, good for objective kind of knowledge. So reality seems to depend on constituting activity of consciousness as per him. Now, third and last stage of reduction as per Husserl is eidetic reduction. Now, this is the final step. And the main aim is grasping the essence or eidos of phenomena. This is the final stage of reduction. And here, the main essence of phenomena are basically reached. So, in ordinary perception, we encounter objects with many accidental features. Now, through eidetic reduction, we imaginatively vary these features and discover what remains invariant. And this is the essence of phenomena. So, for example, when a very crude example, if you want to take, by examining different examples of triangle and varying their properties, we reach to the essence of triangularity. So this is a crude example just to understand what is the essence of the phenomena. So this knowledge is achieved through eidetic reduction, a direct insight into essential structure of phenomena. So Husserl's concept of essence resembles the ideas of Plato. If you have already gone through, you will know, because Plato has given the concept of ideas. But again, there is a difference. Unlike Plato's independent forms, Husserl's essence exists only as it correlates of consciousness. Now, essence and pure phenomena, let us understand this also. After epoche and reduction, what remains? That is, after phenomenological methods application of these two concepts, epoche and reduction. Reduction, as you know, are three kinds or three stages. So after that, what remains finally, or what one gets finally, is pure consciousness and pure phenomena. And these pure phenomena represents the essence or meaning of things. So essences for Husserl are not objects of sense perception or logical deduction. They are directly grasped through eidetic intuition. So Husserl described them as irreal, neither real nor unreal. They are called by him irreal, meaning that they are neither physical objects nor merely subjective ideas. They exist as structures of meaning revealed within consciousness. So because these essences are not distorted by empirical conditions, they provide originary evidence for knowledge, how knowledge can originate. On this basis, Husserl hoped to establish phenomenology as a rigorous philosophical science. Now, critical evaluation of whatever concepts we have taken up, two concepts, epoche and reduction. Now, let us try to understand. Husserl's method has generated several important criticisms. Many philosophers, for example, existentialist philosophers or subsequent phenomenologists, argue that complete presuppositionless philosophy is impossible. Analytical philosophers, for example, Ayer and Ryle, maintain that experience always involves language and conceptual frameworks. Without such frameworks, experience itself would be unintelligible. So this is criticism from analytic philosophers. Then existence phenomenologists, they come up, for example, Heidegger and Sartre, reject the possibility of completely bracketing the world. For them, human existence is fundamentally situated in the world, and therefore the world cannot be set aside in a philosophical analysis. Now, third kind of criticism comes from another school, and the critics argue that Husserl's appeal to eidetic intuition is problematic. If essences are known only through intuition, it becomes difficult to verify such knowledge objectively, because the knowledge will not be objective, it will become a subjective kind of thing. And then finally, linguistic philosophers, later philosophy of language, also challenges Husserl's concepts. Wittgenstein, a linguistic philosopher, argues that concepts often lack a single essence and instead exhibit family resemblances. Because he has given game theory, as you know, but still, the Husserl's method there is importance, and it's quite important despite this criticism. It's quite highly influential. It introduces a new philosophical method focused on careful description of lived experience. His work also inspired major philosophical movements such as existential phenomenology, hermeneutics, existentialism. So, by emphasizing intentional structure of consciousness, because he has emphasized that theory of intentionality has given, affected by Brentano, and analysis of experience, Husserl opened a new direction for 20th century philosophy. Now we'll come to second subtopic, because first topic we have already covered, which was epoche and uh, reduction. Second important subtopic from this chapter is intentionality of consciousness. Now, part of this has already been covered there, because as I told, there will be a number of repetitions also, because all subtopics are interconnected and basically arise from the theory of phenomenology, Husserl. So all are interconnected. So a number of concepts have to be repeated. So now second subtopic is intentionality of consciousness. This again, a number of times questions have been asked on this topic. Now, basics, we know his philosophy was influenced by thinkers like uh, French Benthano and Bolzano also, and through engagement with contemporaries like Mignon, Twardowski, and Gottlob Frege also. Now, Husserl's idea was later influenced by philosophers such as Martin Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty also. Now, at the center of Husserl's phenomenology lies the concept of intentionality of consciousness. Now, this is again a very important concept, because we have already seen it was inspired by these philosophers, and mainly from Benthano, which explains how consciousness relates to objects and meanings. Because every consciousness, every kind of consciousness points towards some object or some meaning. So there is intention. I mean, without intention, there cannot be the consciousness. Now, what is meaning of intentionality? Intentionality refers to directedness or aboutness of consciousness. So the consciousness is directed towards something. Now, to say that consciousness is intentional means that every act of consciousness is directed towards some or the other object. As we have already seen in previous subtopic also, thinking is not, just like that. Thinking is about something. Perceiving is about something. Desiring is desiring something. So always some or the other object is involved. I mean, consciousness is always directed towards some objects. And this is actually the meaning of intentionality. So consciousness is never empty or objectless. There is no, you can say, thing which is pure objectless consciousness. So there has to be an object along with consciousness. And consciousness has to be directed about something. So intentionality therefore explains how our subjective mental acts are related to objects, meanings, and this word itself. So basically, this theory of intentionality answers the philosophical question, how do mental experiences reach beyond the subject and relate to objects? And this is what Husserl's theory of intentionality explains. Now, as we have already seen, there was discussion that his theory of intentionality was influenced by Brentano, because he was the main originator of this theory. Brentano has argued that intentionality is the distinguishing mark of the mental phenomena, or mental state, or mental consciousness. So mental phenomena are characterized by their directedness towards objects, and whereas physical phenomena lack this feature. So mental phenomena or consciousness is always directed towards some or the other object. Husserl has adopted this idea, but further developed it also. So while Brentano used intentionality mainly to distinguish mental from physical phenomena, Husserl has used it to build a complete phenomenological theory of consciousness and knowledge. For Husserl, intentionality is not merely a property of consciousness, it is the very structure of consciousness itself. This is what Husserl, I mean, he has gone one stage ahead of what Brentano. Brentano was very simply with medical, how mental and physical phenomena are distinguished. He was limited to that. But here he has developed this total structure of consciousness itself using that theory. Now, intentional object and non-existence objects. We have already discussed that intentional object can be real object as well as non-existent objects also. So this was also an important feature of Husserl's theory, that intentional objects need not actually exist. Consciousness can be towards or directed towards objects like, that are imaginary or fictional. For example, Golden Mountain or a unicorn. Such objects may not exist in reality, but they still function. So there also theory of intentionality works. So intentionality shows that relation between consciousness and object is independent of the actual existence of object. So even for non-existence objects, this theory is equally true. So intentionality therefore is description dependent rather than existence dependent. That was the concept given by Husserl. Now there are two sub-concepts in this important in theory of intentionality, noesis and noema. Now, because in analyzing intentionality, Husserl distinguishes between two important aspects. First is noesis, that is act of consciousness itself, and second is noema, that is object or meaning intended in the act. Because as we have seen earlier, there were two parts. One is the consciousness, and second is the object or meaning towards which it is directed. So noesis is the consciousness itself, and noema is the object or meaning towards which the consciousness has been directed. So for example, simple example, if we take perceiving is a noetic act, but perceived object as intended is the noema. Now noetic act constitutes the noema. In other words, objects are not simply given independently, but they appear within the structure of intentional consciousness. So therefore, Husserl explains that the noetic act itself has two aspects. First, meaning giving act, and second, meaning fulfilling act. Now, what is meaning giving act? Sorry. The act that directs consciousness towards an object. This is meaning giving act. The act in which the intended object is actually presented or fulfilled in experience is the meaning fulfilling act. Now, through this noesis and noema structure, intentionality explains how meaning is constituted in any consciousness. Now, another related topic in this is intentionality and unity of meaning. Now, intentionality provides unity of meaning according to Husserl. Different acts of consciousness may relate to the same object but in different ways. For example, to give an example, the same object may be perceived or remembered, or even imagined or judged. So all these acts are different, but intentionality ensures that they are directed toward the same object or meaning. So intentionality is fundamental not only to perception, but also to memory, judgment, imagination, and other maybe experience, different kinds of experiences. Now, because of this important role, Husserl believed that a systematic theory of intentionality could clarify many philosophical problems. That was Husserl's viewpoint. And a number of problems are there in epistemology or philosophy of language or philosophy of logic, philosophy of mind, theory of action and value. So Husserl believed that all these philosophical problems could be clarified by a systematic theory of intentionality. Now, how intentionality and phenomenology or phenomenological method are related, now let us see that. In Husserl's phenomenology, intentionality reveals that consciousness and object are inseparable correlates, because consciousness is directed towards some object or the thing. Objects are always given as objects for consciousness, while consciousness is always consciousness of something. So, this is how both are related. Now, this correlation between consciousness and object forms the very basis of Husserl's phenomenological analysis. Now, because through this study of intentional structures, phenomenology aims to describe how objects, meaning, and knowledge are constituted in experience. So, basically, if you see, phenomenology is basically a method to study the experience or to consciousness or sensations. That's what basically this is a method of studying philosophical issues or subjects, you can say. Now, what is the critical evaluation or critical points pertaining to this theory of intentionality? Now, Husserl's theory of intentionality has been obviously quite influential, and the criticism has come from many quarters. Now, first, if we see, the criticism is that not all aspects of consciousness are intentional. For example, certain mental states, such as moods or diffuse feelings, may lack a clear object and therefore challenge Husserl's claim that all consciousness is intentional. So, maybe certain kinds of consciousness are not intentional. So, that is what first criticism. Secondly, existential philosophers such as Heidegger and Sartre reinterpret intentionality in different way. Heidegger emphasizes that human existence is fundamentally being in the world, and therefore intentionality cannot be understood simply as a relation between an inner consciousness and an external object. So that was the criticism from Heidegger. Now, third kind of criticism is that Husserl's analysis of noesis and noema makes the constitution of objects overly dependent on consciousness. Now, this may lead towards a form of transcendental subjectivism. This was earlier criticism also, because this may, in that process, objectivity may be lost. However, these criticisms often represent various developments of Husserl's insights rather than its complete reduction, because on this kind of analysis, subsequent philosophy of various philosophers has also been built upon. Now, what is the significance? Despite these criticisms, intentionality remains one of Husserl's most important contributions. The development of phenomenology after Husserl largely revolves around different interpretations of intentionality. His analysis is influenced existential phenomenology, hermeneutics, and contemporary discussions in philosophy of mind and cognitive science also. So, by showing the consciousness is essential, intentional, and meaning directed, Husserl provided a powerful framework for understanding the relation between mind, meaning, and the world. So, his theories also influence psychological developments or psychology also subsequently. Now, we'll reach to third subtopic. This is again Husserl's conception of philosophy as rigorous science. On this also, a number of times questions have been asked. So now let us try to understand what is the Husserl's conception of philosophy as a rigorous science. he basically insisted that philosophy must aspire to become a rigorous science. By this, Husserl did not mean science in a very, natural science or physics, chemistry kind of science, but a disciplined and systematic form of knowledge grounded in absolute evidence. That was what he meant, basically. Now, he has also coined a German term I'm given, Wissenschaft, includes both natural sciences and human sciences. Husserl believed that philosophy, like these disciplines, should possess methodological clarity, objective validity, and systematic organization. So basically, scientific methodology should be introduced in philosophy. That's what his concept was. But however, unlike empirical sciences, philosophy must investigate the ultimate foundation of knowledge itself. So for this reason, Husserl proposed phenomenology as the method through which philosophy could become a rigorous science. So that was what phenomenology basically, it's a method to study science, philosophy, in a very, very scientific way or scientific manner. Now, how phenomenology can become foundation of rigorous philosophy? Phenomenology, according to Husserl, is the direct description of experience as it appears to the consciousness. We have already seen how, applying theory of epoche and reduction, we reach to pure consciousness, presuppositionless consciousness. So, this is direct description of experience, which is free from theoretical and metaphysical presuppositions. And he has given the concept of presuppositionless consciousness. He believed that philosophy had long suffered from confusion because earlier philosophers relied on speculative metaphysical systems, historical traditions, psychological explanations of knowledge. So to overcome all this, Husserl argued that philosophy must return to things themselves. This was another his slogan, to return to things themselves. This means that philosophical investigation should begin from immediate experience and the structures of consciousness rather than from speculative theories. So therefore, phenomenology becomes a science of consciousness, whose task is to describe the essential structure of experience. Now, philosophy and the demand for absolute foundations. Now, let us try to understand this. Husserl has expressed this program most clearly in his famous, Philosophy as a Rigorous Science was his essay, which came in 1911. In that, he has described philosophy and the demand for absolute foundations. Now, what he argued is that philosophy must move beyond the merely cognizant and factual knowledge of empirical science and discover the essential structures that make knowledge possible. So, empirical sciences basically operate by collecting data and forming generalizations. Their results remain provisional. These are the characteristics of empirical sciences, natural sciences, you can say. Their results remain provisional and dependent on experience. But philosophy must provide the ultimate foundation of knowledge, and not the provisional and dependent results. So, according to Husserl, this can be achieved only through phenomenological reduction, which reveals the essential structures of consciousness and meaning. Through this method, philosophy can arrive at universal and necessary insights, which Husserl called essences. As we have seen earlier, also in earlier subtopic, the concept of essences has come, which is universal and necessary kind of consciousness. Now, what is presuppositionless philosophy? A central requirement of philosophy to become rigorous is that it must be presuppositionless. Husserl called it or declared that philosophy begins in absolute poverty. This is again another slogan of Husserl, which means that philosophy should not begin with inherited doctrines, metaphysical assumptions, or scientific theories. It should begin from zero. It should begin from absolute poverty. Instead, it must start with pure description of experience, that is, essences. In order to achieve this presuppositionless standpoint, Husserl proposed the method of epoche, through which he suspends our natural belief in the existence of word and examine how objects appear in consciousness. Now, this suspension allows the philosophers to discover phenomenologically reduced pure phenomena, which provide primordial evidence on which philosophy and all sciences ultimately depend. So, in this respect, Husserl's project shows an affinity with the methodological radicalism of Descartes. I mean, you can compare that. Although Husserl replaces Cartesian doubt, because Cartesian doubt is a very, very simple to be, I think, therefore I exist. So, that kind of thing is not exactly here, but to some extent, similarity can be there. Now, he came up with critique of naturalism also and critique of psychologism also. So, to bring it, I mean, his own theory, because these were earlier prevalent theories. So, according to Husserl, the naturalism assumes that everything belongs to natural world and can be explained by methods of natural sciences. Now, this view treats consciousness itself as a natural phenomena, often reducing it to brain processes. Husserl argued that this view overlooks the fact that all scientific knowledge itself presupposes consciousness. So, therefore, before studying the natural world, we must first understand the structure of consciousness through which the world is experienced itself, and then therefore he came up for phenomenological method. So, thus, phenomenology does not study nature directly. It studies how nature is given to consciousness through theory of intentionality. So, only by analyzing consciousness itself, philosophy can provide the ultimate foundation of knowledge. Now, along with naturalism, he also came up with critique of psychologism. Now, what is that? This was another obstacle according to him, naturalism and psychologism. Psychologism is the view that logical and mathematical truths, this earlier also it has come up and we have explained it, are grounded in psychological processes. Now, thinkers such as Mill attempted to explain logical laws in terms of mental operations. So, he was one of the promoters of psychologism. Husserl strongly rejected this view. And in his book, Logical Investigations, he has come up in detail. He argued that logical and mathematical laws are ideal and objective, not dependent on the psychological states of individual. So, if you take up mathematics, the proposition 2 plus 2, 4 remains true whether or not anyone thinks about it. So, logical principles such as law of non-contradiction do not arise from psychological habits. They are normative principles governing correct reasoning and always true, basically. So, psychology merely describes how people think, whereas logic evaluates whether thinking is valid or correct. So, if logical laws were reduced to psychology, they would become relative to individual minds, leading to skepticism and relativism. So, therefore, Husserl insisted that logic and mathematics possess ideal validity independent of psychological process, and he rejected accordingly psychological method, psychological process, and he was against the theory of psychologism. Now, phenomenology basically aims to search the essences, and that happens once naturalism and psychologism are rejected. So, philosophy can proceed towards its true goal, the discovery of essential structures of experience. Through phenomenological reduction, consciousness is purified of presuppositions, allowing to grasp pure phenomena. So, thus, pure phenomena reveals the essence of things. Now, in this respect, Husserl's view resembles the doctrine of universals found in Plato. Earlier also, we have come Plato's theory of forms, but it's not exactly the same, because here Husserl's essences are not dependent on metaphysical entity. They are structures of meaning revealed within consciousness. So, by uncovering such essential structures, phenomenology aims to provide a secure foundation for all knowledge, thereby establishing philosophy as a rigorous science. Now, what is the critical evaluation of this concept? First, critics were or analytic philosophers. They argued that absolute presuppositionlessness is impossible. For example, analytical philosophers like Ayer and Ryle maintain that experience always involves language and conceptual frameworks. Without such frameworks, experience itself would be unintelligible. Now, second group of critics, they argued that Husserl's appeal to eidetic intuition and senses may involve a circular justification, since intuition is used to discover essences while essences are invoked to validate intuition. Now, third kind of critics claim that Husserl's phenomenology ultimately leads to transcendental subjectivism because the constitution of objects appears to depend on the consciousness. And another school of linguistic philosophy, for example, Ludwig Wittgenstein, challenges the idea that concepts possess fixed essences. Wittgenstein proposed the notion of family resemblance, according to which meanings arise from patterns of use rather than universal structures. What is the significance? Despite all this criticism, Husserl's philosophy or conception of philosophy as a rigorous science remains one of the very, very key and influential concepts of 20th century. Phenomenology introduced a new philosophical method based on careful description of lived experience and the search for essential structures of consciousness. Husserl's work inspired a number of philosophical movements, for example, existential phenomenology, hermeneutics, contemporary philosophy of mind. Even philosophers who criticized this project, such as Heidegger and Sartre, developed their ideas in dialogue with his phenomenology. So Husserl's attempt to establish philosophy as a rigorous science grounded in the analysis of consciousness remains a very, very important and foundational movement in modern philosophy. Husserl's work inspired with this, I have covered all the three topics which were repeatedly, subtopics you can say, which were repeatedly asked again and again in previous years. Now in next class, we will take up some other important topic which is very, very usually very, very relevant as far as UPSC exam or philosophy optional for UPSC is concerned. Now thank you for joining the class. Thank you.